This was a talk I gave last night on February 26, 2020 at the San Diego Python meetup, and I forgot to record it. So here goes. If you're already familiar with the Django Admin, or you saw my previous talks about the Django Admin last year or on the YouTube channel, then you're aware that it is a very powerful tool for managing your website. However, you have to take care when you put such power on the public internet. This is not an exhaustive talk on securing a web server. That wouldn't be a 5 to 7 minute talk. However, there are some finer details of putting a Django site on the internet that I can't skip, so I'll discuss those briefly and at least point you in the right direction for the rest. There's also additional resources at the end of the slides. Everybody loves the Django admin, but there's a few deployment musts and there's a few security issues with putting it, or security implications of putting it on the public internet. First, let's talk about the deployment musts. The security of a lot of things in Django depend on the secret key being secret, so keep it a secret. This includes things like authentication in sessions. If your secret key leaks, malicious users could generate password reset links for admins or simply generate a valid session cookie for an admin. It's really bad. Keep it a secret. Don't check it into source control. Don't ever run debug equals true on the public internet. This includes even some sort of staging server or a QA server. It leaks a ton of information, like the settings used in configuration, what third-party apps are in use. Showing tracebacks to a malicious user is super bad. It just leaks too much information. Don't do it. Django has a built-in checker, manage.py check deploy, which checks for a number of different configuration issues that are a problem. You should run it in production when you deploy a Django site. Also, they have a deployment checklist in the official documentation. It's really good. And I can't stress enough how much simpler it is to run a site on something like a managed host like Heroku or Python Anywhere, even Elastic Beanstalk, Google App Engine, Azure App Service. They configure your firewall, they manage your database and SSH access, they are reasonably secure by default typically, unless you really know what you're doing or you have the time to spend to figure that out. Let a company that does know what they're doing do it for you. So I talked a little bit about settings in development and prod. One of the easiest ways to have different settings for development and prod is literally to have different settings files. In this example, I've split my settings into development settings and production settings, and they both inherit off of a common base. You'll notice in my production settings here in the lower right, keeping the secrets out of the file, out of source control. I don't want them ever to get checked in accidentally. That's a recipe for leaking these secrets, whether it's login credentials or the secret key. Instead, put this configuration either to environment variables, like what I've done here, or you could read it from a config file. There's lots of options. Any of these are fine. There's a few different Python packages to help you do this. I like Django Environ, but any of them should be okay. You could just use the OS module if that works for you. These are all good, but don't check it into source control. The other thing I wanted to talk about is only ever serve the admin over HTTPS. There's a small caveat to this, but it basically almost always applies. Serving the admin over plain HTTP can compromise your user's credentials. Even serving it over both HTTP and HTTPS is bad. If you or one of your users accesses the admin over public Wi-Fi over plain HTTP, it's pretty trivial to capture the username and password. Redirect plain HTTP to HTTPS, preferably for the whole site, but at least the admin. And again, many of the managed hosting providers make it easier to use it, easier to set up HTTPS, issue an SSL certificate, set it up properly, all those sorts of things. So, lean on them. Once you have HTTPS set up in Django, there are a few settings that are specific to running the site over HTTPS. Make sure you do set these, so you can set the session cookies to be secure. That way they are never sent over plain HTTP requests. There's a ton more settings. This secure SSL redirect makes sure to redirect HTTP to HTTPS. This is again where manage.py check deploy will help. It sort of checks all these settings and makes sure you didn't miss one. One other thing to discuss is that the Django admin login is not rate limited, meaning somebody can just hammer it and try hundreds of thousands of requests a day without sort of raising any alarms or anything. They'll just try tons of password combinations until they log in successfully. Many web servers like Nginx or Apache can set up to be rate limited. Um, I also there's pretty good reasons why Django doesn't have built-in rate limiting. It typically relies on some other service like a caching service or something like that to actually do the rate limiting, which might not be set up in your production environment. So that's sort of why they don't do it. There's a few rate limiting plugins for Django. Again, they sort of rely on caching. You could use one of those. Probably the biggest authentication admin, Django AllAuth, supports rate limiting out of the box, assuming you have a cache. Or you could put something like Cloudflare in front of it on the internet, and that can rate limit logins. But just make sure you have something. Um, the other thing I mentioned is, I said you have to take care when you put the Django admin on the public internet. One of the other ways to do this is to just not put the Django admin on the public internet. So this is a relatively simple configuration to selectively include the Django admin. So here, basically, if you set this admin enabled environment variable to false, the admin URLs are just not added to your Django site. While there's still some web server setup you might want to do, this would allow you to, with only changing environment variables, have, say, one web instance where you have the Django admin enabled and one where you don't. So your public site could, for example, not have the Django admin enabled, and you could have the Django admin enabled only on a server that is restricted to certain IPs or requires a VPN or something like that. It still requires a login, but you've locked it down much more. This is a great setup. Um, if you don't have a great way to set up a second server with the admin, at least customize the admin URL to not be /admin. So here again, you can specify the admin URL in as an environment variable. Setting it to something like a 50-character random string will drastically reduce the amount of bots testing your login. But again, I would still say the best approach is to lock it down behind a VPN or behind some IP firewall. Just some resources at the end of the talk. Peter Baumgartner's DjangoCon 2019 talk, DjangoCon US, prepping your project for production, was really useful. It's a longer talk. It's linked here in the slides. I'll put it in the comments on YouTube. It has more than just security trade-offs. It talks more trade-offs about hosting providers, and it has some stuff about performance and stuff like that. But it's a great talk, really worthwhile. Mozilla has a deployment tutorial. It heavily skews towards Heroku, but it has some in-depth explanations about the why behind some of these things. Again, check out the Django deployment checklist and the Django security docs. And Mozilla Observatory is sort of a scanner. It's sort of a black box scanner. It checks your website for some of the misconfiguration issues that manage.py check deploy checks for, except it does it in a black box way by just sort of making a few requests to your web server. I'm linking to my past talks, and I'll probably have a future talk on this. But that's basically my talk, and thanks for listening. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the comments. Thank you.